Our founder is Pastor Danny Carpenter. Tonight's lesson is entitled Racism. Now, please welcome our instructor, Pastor Danny Carpenter.
Thank you. Our topic tonight by announcement is racism, a biblical answer and a remedy. Our premise will be simple for this lesson. It is first to show that racial discrimination is actually not shown in the Bible. It will surprise some to discover that it's actually not a topic, that it's not shown, demonstrated in any way. Racial profiling is relatively modern, and it does have an immoral purpose, and we'll show how modern, how contemporary racial profiling is in this lesson. And we'll also point out that Christians are not and cannot be racist and be Christian. So the question is usually asked, isn't racism demonstrated in the conflicts in the Old Testament? By conflicts, we usually mean the battles, the wars, the fighting, the skirmishes. And the answer simply is no. But to get to the answer, it would be nice to pause for a moment and look at just a tree of Abraham's life. I don't know if you can see this on your screen, but try, get real close to your TV and put on your binoculars or your, what do we call them, your progressives, and see if you can see this. This is just Abraham. And so let me try to hit a few points about the descendants of Abraham. God promised Abraham that if he would follow him, he would take him to a land that he had pledged to give him, and that he would make of him many nations. He would be the father of many nations. So now, with that in mind, Abraham had a son named Ishmael through an Egyptian woman who was the maidservant of his wife, Sarah. And Genesis 25 lists, these are the generations of Ishmael. I shouldn't try to pronounce these. Nebahath, Kedar, Abdil, Mibsam, Mishma, Duma, Massa, Hadar, Tema, Jetur, Naphish, Kedema. These are all the children had by Abraham through Hagar, Sarah's handmaiden, who was an Egyptian. I don't know what race you would want to put on them after that, but just keep this in mind. And then he married a woman named Keturah, Abraham did. And here are some of the children from that marriage: Zimran, Jokshan, Medan, Midian, Ishbak, and Shua. And then Jokshan was the father of Sheba and Dedan. Dedan's descendants were the Asherites, Letushites, Lemuites. Midian's sons were Epher, Hanok, Abida, Eldai. Those were the generations, or descendants rather, from Abraham and his marriage to Keturah. And then, of course, everyone knows about his marriage to Sarah, and that he and Sarah had a son named Isaac. And then Isaac had two sons, Jacob and Esau. And Jacob, whose name was changed to Israel, became the father, I suppose, of the Jewish nations. The 12 tribes of Israel are named from the 12 descendants, the 12 sons of Jacob. And Esau also, was split off from the family, if you please. There was a conflict between the two sons, the two brothers, for a long, long time. And so just in a nutshell, when you look at all the names on that chart on your screen, all of the offspring, all of the tribes, all of the peoples created by those names, and then you go back and start reading about some of the skirmishes and the battles and the conflicts, it's impossible to assign race to any of those conflicts. None of those battles and none of their conflicts were ever over the color of anyone's skin. They were never over they were never because someone was of a different race. By and large, they were over the wars, the conflicts were over grudges, like in Esau and Jacob. They were over long-standing grudges, or they were over territorial conquest or expansion, or just the expansion of kingdoms. And so there is no point in Scripture where race is mentioned, the color of skin is mentioned, or that it's ever used for the reason of conquering, fighting, feuding in any way whatsoever. So when we say that the color of skin is never mentioned in the Bible, we mean in terms of race. There are only a couple of instances where the color of skin is spoken of, and they're very easily taken away from being about race. One, for example, is in Song of Solomon, chapter 1, verse 5, that says, "I am black but comely." And then in verse 6, she explains, "Because the sun hath looked upon me." If you flip over and read that sometime as part of this lesson or your study of race, don't assume that this is Solomon speaking, because it's not. It's the Shulamite slave. She was a slave. I think this is why some people think, without reading the rest of the text, that she's actually referring to her skin, meaning her race. But she says in verse 6 that her mother's children, indicating that they may not have been blood children, different fathers. Her mother's children didn't like her, so they made her the keeper of the family's vineyards. And that's why she says, "The sun hath looked upon me," because they made me, my mother's children made me the keeper of our vineyards. So she had to live outdoors much of her life. And as such, she had become dark from the sun. Nothing implied about race in this story whatsoever, or in any story. Lamentations is another example. Lamentations, the 5th chapter, verse 10, has a phrase that says, "Our skin was black like an oven because of a terrible famine that came," meaning they were disease-ridden and it had affected the color of their skin. This is pretty much it. There's absolutely no indication of color of skin anywhere else. But this is a story that gets some traction in today's racial climate. There are those who will turn to Numbers, the 12th chapter, and try to make this about race. I get the point that's made by them, but I think the Scripture itself makes it clear that it's not about race. The story, if you are not familiar with it, you can read it from Numbers, the 12th chapter. I only put the gist of it up on your screen. But Miriam and Aaron, Moses' siblings, spoke against him because of the Ethiopian woman he married, the Cushite woman. She was a Cushite. I'm not sure if we know for sure that it was Ethiopia as we know Ethiopia now. It most likely was along the Nile, west or east of the Nile, somewhere in that region. But because Cushites are considered, at least in contemporary studies, the Cushites are considered to be Ethiopians, and Ethiopians are dark-skinned people, then the assumption is made that Moses had married a dark-skinned woman who was a Cushite, who was an Ethiopian. And so his sister and Aaron spoke against him. They undermined him. They sowed discord among other Jews, questioning his leadership because he had married her. Now, there is no indication that their complaint against her had anything to do with the color of her skin or even her race, as much as it was against Moses for not marrying within his own kind. And it's difficult to make that about race. In the same way you can't say a Jew is a specific race because it's not, it's a religion. You can't say Islam or an Islamic person is a race because it's a religion. Muslim is not a race, it's the follower of Islam. In that same sense, you can't say that Jews are a racist people, but they were absolutely clannish people. They did believe they were God's favored people through Abraham's loins. You know, God told Abraham he'd make him the father of many nations, and that's why Arabs and Jews alike claim Abraham as their father. He fathered Ishmael. Ishmael had his offspring. He fathered Esau, grandfathered Esau, had his offspring. And then through Keturah, he had numerous children responsible for the formation of numerous tribes. And it's impossible to look at that tree we had a minute ago on the screen. It's impossible to look at that and say those are all the same race or those are all different races, because it's just pretty much impossible to delineate any kind of race there. Hagar was an Egyptian woman, and he had children by her. We could ask, what was Abraham? I don't know. Was he a Chaldean? Some would say, well, he was a Jew. Well, he's only a Jew by religion. And only that because God simply chose him and set him apart from others to have the covenant with him based on faith, leading us up to ultimate salvation in the Christian era. So it's just impossible to go through this and make this about race, Moses' story about race. And here's a quick reason why. If you make it about race, then it requires that you're making an assumption. If you think this story shows that Miriam and Aaron were prejudiced against dark-skinned people and that's your theory, then you're making the assumption she was dark-skinned, and we have no reason to know whether she was or she was not. It is simply not told us. And we're not even sure where Ethiopia was in ancient times or if it even existed as we know it today. And so it's just impossible to make this about color of skin. You can make the assumptions. So if you assume this story is about the color of her skin, and you assume therefore that she was dark-skinned, then you're also making an assumption that Moses was light-skinned. And there's no reason for us to believe Moses was a white European. I say that jokingly, he could not have been, but there's no reason for us to assume he was white any more than there's reason for us to assume she was dark. And so he may well have been dark, and my assumption and hunch would be he's probably much darker than most of us are. But that's all, it's still an assumption. We have no reason to see color injected here scripturally in any way whatsoever. So we have to make an assumption that she was dark, he was white, if we're going to make that story about race. The truth is, color of skin was never mentioned his nor her. And the ultimate truth is, we do know that it was considered wrong to marry outside of the Jewish race. A Jewish boy was told to marry within the Jewish ranks. And those stories are corroborated by numerous other stories through the Bible, Samson just being one, and not necessarily a pretty one, about a boy who was more content with the Philistine women than he was the Jewish women, and so on and so forth. So the one thing we do know in concluding that story is that God was angry, period. Their anger toward Moses, for whatever their reason was, angered God. So even if you make the assumption that that story was about the color of her skin and racism, then you have to come right back behind it and say, and see, God got angry at that. God wasn't pleased with that. That's not the will of God. So remember, our premise is to show that racism simply is not a biblical topic in itself, in and of itself, and that it was never demonstrated in any way in the Bible. So another argument some have is, since God told Israel to take captives, doesn't that prove that God condoned racism? And so God did in fact tell Israel to take captives. He did in fact give Moses instruction how to care for and what to do about servants, how to treat them, and so on and so forth. But again, to assume that because of the system, the feudal-like system of conquering and being conquered, which permeates human history, to assume that that word captive or servant or slave has any connotation toward the skin color of a person is a false assumption. They did not make slaves out of people because their skin was darker. They made slaves out of people that looked just like them and might have even been the same race they were. They made slaves out of them because they conquered their territory and took captive the able-bodied people who would become their workers, much as they had been slaves in Egypt. They weren't always slaves in Egypt. They went there under Joseph and under the permission and kindness of a Pharaoh who actually promoted Joseph. But over a process of time, and 400 years later, they had become a slave nation. And so they were very familiar with the system. Conquer someone, make them your servant or your slave. Not because you are prejudiced about the color of their skin. So captives were often made slaves and or servants, but race of such people that was never named in the Bible as a factor or in any way. Slavery and servitude are part and parcel of many of the feudal systems. And feudal systems I put in quote because that's not exactly a good description of those kinds of governments. It wasn't always about land and caste systems, but that's a good historical phrase to just explain that this was part and parcel of that style of government. You conquer, then you use and you utilize the people to become your servants regardless of what color their skin is. It was never about the color of anyone's skin. It was always about, this is why we went to war, so we could beat you and then you could work for us. And the Egyptians made, half the stuff we see in the ruins in Egypt probably made by Jewish hands because they were the slaves of the pharaohs during the era of the pyramids and other things. God gave Moses rules for servants. Does not prove racism. It just proves that he knew that system exists, and God himself told Israel to go in, conquer that territory. But in God's rules for servants or slaves, the word servants is in the King James. It's probably fair for some to go ahead and make that the word slave. The problem with it is that nowadays when you talk about slavery, trying to come to biblical understandings, the connotation of slave almost invariably goes back to blacks in America. And that's not what we're talking about. And that's not what God was talking about in giving Moses in Exodus 21st chapter rules for servants. Jewish families, Hebrew families, Israel families that had servants from conquering tribes and what have you, those servants worked for them. They were never told in any way to beat them or abuse them. Those servants worked for them according to God's instruction to Moses. They could only work for them 6 years and then they had to be set free. That was God's instruction to Moses. You can work your captives, your servants, your slaves, to use a modern term for it. You can work them for 6 years, and the 7th year, he must be allowed to go free. Now, it did go on to say if he brought a wife with him, when you got him and he had a wife came with him, he and his wife, or if they had children when you got them, when you captured their village and you got those in, the wife and the children have to be allowed to leave with him after 6 years, and they are free people. That's the way it was. However, if after you got him as a single man, he marries somebody within your group, she stays with you when he goes, at least for 6 years. You understand? He might have married her after he'd been your servant for 3 years, and then he's free in 3 more years, but she's got 3 more years to work for you because she fits the same rule. She will work the 6 years, and then you have to set her free. He also said, if they choose to stay, if your servants decide they want to stay working for you and stay with you, then you have to keep them forever. You can't just say, now I'm done with you. You have to keep them if they want to stay. And then you take them down in front of the village elders and you pull the ear against the post and you pierce it, like earrings for piercing. You pierce it with an awl. They put a little sharp instrument up there and pierce the earlobe, put a little ring in it. And some people read that and they say, well, that was cruel. Not at all. The reason for piercing the ear and putting the See, if he stayed with him, then someone would say, oh, wait a minute, how long have you had this man? You can only have him 6 years. You were supposed to set him free. And so they could argue, debate, they could take him to civil court, they could even have fights over, you've kept this man too long, or someone else wants him. Maybe someone wants to buy him, put him up for auction, whatever. As soon as that ear is pierced and the ring put through, he is no longer available to anyone else. So as cruel as it sounds to have slavery and servitude, which it's a pretty cruel system, thank God we don't live under it today, but a lot of people have. But as cruel as it is, that particular little episode was just a way of saying this man is not available to anybody else. Now, you know, the bad way of saying it is this man belongs to someone else for the rest of his life. But that was by his choice to stay there and become part of that working family and that farm or whatever he worked. And that all through the ear was simply a way of taking him off of anybody else's target. He is basically free for that master for the rest of his life. So then, knowing that that's accepted in the Old Testament, not slavery per se, none of it based on color of skin, knowing that that's accepted, some people think, well, Christ kind of corrected the pattern of some of the things in the Old Testament. He kind of dabbled with the law. You know, on one hand, you say he fulfilled the law. On the other, some people say he kind of did away with the law. He didn't do away with it. Fulfilling is a better way of saying it. So why didn't he correct the Old Testament pattern? He had plenty of opportunities to correct the Old Testament pattern. He did do this. He taught that love was a fulfillment of the law of Moses. When he was pinned down by scribes and those who questioned in his day, which law should I follow? Which is the greatest law? His simple response to them was, on these two things hang all the law, meaning all the law of Moses. And his simple response was, love the Lord thy God with all your heart, and love your neighbor as you love yourself. On these two things hang all the law of Moses. So now, you know, we can debate how that's even possible when you look at just the 10 Commandments, for example. Well, that'd be the easier ones that'd be easier than the 613 total to define how love translates into those. But nonetheless, forget the literal step-by-step application of 613 laws. Just take Christ's statement for what it is. Can you love the Lord your God with all your heart and love your neighbor as you love yourself and abuse your neighbor in any way whatsoever? Forget the color of his skin. If he's green and you're purple, can you abuse that person if you're loving them as you love yourself? The answer is clearly, of course, no. Can you abuse a black person if you're white? Or can you abuse a white person if you're black? If you're following Christ's 2 commandments on which all the law hangs. If you love the Lord your God with all your heart and you love your neighbor as you love yourself and you treat them as you want to be treated, then that in itself abolishes any kind of cruelty or slavery of any kind. Christ did not teach us that we were supposed to be political activists and set things straight. Christ lived in a corrupt society. The Roman Empire was corrupt. The Roman Caesars were nasty. Some of them were dirty and rotten. In Paul's time, Nero lived. He was maybe one of the most vulgar Caesars of Rome. He had some heinous and perverted practices concerning captive boys, boys who were captured by his military as they expanded their territorial conquest. And I won't even go into detail. It's there, it's readable. Some of you have already read his story and you know he was a perverted and nasty and vile man. And yet, the Apostle Paul did not write to the churches and the ministers of his day and urge them into political activism to stop those corrupt government leaders. Christ himself, when confronted with people who didn't really like the law and didn't want to have to contribute, asking about taxes and money, Christ's clever response was, hand me a coin. They handed a coin. He said, whose inscription is on that? And they said, Caesar's. And his response was just, well, then give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar and give to God what belongs to God. Which is a kind of a clever way of saying, hey, folks, does your government want your taxes to be paid? Well, then pay your taxes. I don't know if you get an extension this year or not because of pandemic. If you don't, you're going to owe them by April 15th. Somebody said they pushed it up to June. You better verify that before you find out, before you trust me. And then when that day comes, I'm just going to tell you what Jesus said, give to your government what your government gets, and give to God something totally different. And so that's Christ's way of saying, I didn't come here to tell you to overthrow your government. I didn't come here to tell you to be activists and set the record straight. I didn't come here to tell you fight against political corruption wherever you see it. That Greco-Roman influence was corrupt. It was pitiful. It was nasty. They abused people. Nero even put Christians in some cases up on poles and set them on fire, put tar on them so they'd burn for a long, long time and light a few streets to show everybody how mean and tough he was, and what a nice street lamp that would have made with a handful of Christians stuck up on a pole burning. Corruption. And yet Paul never, none of the apostles, Christ, nobody ever said, we got to beat this stinking system. Nowadays we have a lot of Christians becoming much more politically motivated than they are God motivated. Becoming much more concerned about laws and regulations and setting things right and making up for lost time and let's correct the record. And yet so much of the correction that's being espoused today is simply a flipping of the coin. It's okay, you had your turn to abuse, now we want our turn to abuse. Any form of abuse is wrong. Whether it's against whites or blacks, it's wrong. Whether it's against any color of skin, it's wrong. It's also not supported by Scripture in any way. And Christ, when Christ said, give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar and give to God what belongs to God, I'll paraphrase in a sense for him. Give Caesar the money that belongs to, pay your taxes, don't worry about it. I don't like taxes. I don't like knowing my tax dollars go to abortions. I'm totally against abortions and abortion clinics. And so I don't like that my tax money goes there. But Christ didn't call me to say, hold back your taxes, go to prison, fight that system. Just pay the taxes, move on. And then when it comes to what you teach, what you practice, what you preach, what you encourage your family, your friends to do, support them, help them find alternatives to sin, alternatives to abortion. One of the things that cripples us and hurts us about abortion is that the government pays for it so it's free. Why doesn't the government pay for adoption so that a girl could have the baby and let it be adopted free? And now she has a choice to make. The other choice is, oh, I get a free abortion or I have to spend $25,000 to have a baby. My family doesn't have $10,000 for a doctor and hospital, and then we can't pay adoption fees. Just to adopt a child is $25,000 for the adopting family. To give a child a home, I've got a daughter who's adopted 2 of them. That's why I know that number is right, $25,000 to adopt a child. That's wrong. But Christ didn't call me to be an activist and fight the system. He just called us to love and love and love. And then if it requires we open our pocketbooks to love a little bit more and $25,000 worth, then we just keep loving. Let the government do whatever the government's going to do. Let the followers of the government do whatever they're going to do. Christians, however, love the Lord with all their heart and love their neighbor as their self. And that was Christ's command. That's what Paul taught. In fact, here's proof of Paul. Paul's short book, Philemon. Philemon apparently owned a servant, a slave or a bondservant named Onesimus at one time. It appears that Onesimus might have escaped from Philemon just because he heard Paul preaching and wanted to go follow Paul. And so he may have just followed Paul and become a groupie, if you please. I don't know. That's my language, not biblical language. But Paul wrote the letter he wrote to Philemon in particular because of Onesimus. And in that letter, he urges Philemon, I'm going to send him back to you. I'm sending Onesimus to you. Please receive him as a brother, not as a bondservant, not as your slave. If he owes you anything from when he left you, and you feel cheated because you had to pay for him or whatever, then lay whatever he owes you to my charge. I'll pay it. I'll take care of it. Just receive him like a brother. He's been a brother to me. And so this is Paul's, if you want to make this a statement about slavery, that's exactly what it is. If you want to make it a statement about race, it's not, because we do not know the race of Onesimus. We don't know the race of Philemon. We can assume they were both Greek. We don't know. And we don't know the color of their skin. This is a statement about how to treat servants or slaves, or how not to have them at all. This is Paul saying, I'm sending him back to you. I know he left probably owing you something. When he comes back, don't abuse him. Don't punish him. I'm asking you not even take him back as a servant. Bring him back as a brother. And if he owes you anything, let me take care of it. So there's the New Testament's sole response to servitude. But again, nothing is implied or stated here about race. So it's fair for us to say, do we know when racism began? It's also fair for us to say, of course not. We have no way of knowing when the first person looked at a person of other color and said, I don't like them. I don't trust them. I think they're inferior to me. We have no idea when that started. However, what we can do is show you when racist viewpoints in writings began to occur, and we can show you when governments started getting involved in racism. Did you know, and it might surprise you to know, did you know that racial profiling, the description of people based on their color of skin and features, is a relatively modern concept? And when I say relatively modern, I mean, you know, we've been running around here for a few thousand years, and we can't find anything descriptive of racial profiling until the mid-1700s. Sometime, I think around 1725, a man named Carolus Linnæus. And by the way, if you, I know you're watching by live streaming, but if you come by church and you pick up one of these, it will have a few, many more details in it than we're giving on the video session, and even a little picture of SYSTEMA NATURATE, the booklet that I'm referring to here, the pamphlet written by Carolus Linnæus. It's the first writing that we can find. I put 25 in with a question mark on it because I'm not sure of the date, and the reason I'm not sure of the date is not because it wasn't written then, but because he left it open-ended to revise it frequently. I think I read once that he actually revised SYSTEMA NATURATE maybe a dozen times over a process of several years. So that's why the first edition, where he might have had the categories of men, I put a question mark behind it. If you research it, you might find a different year. That's the reason I put a question mark there. The four categories he decided that humanity fell in. Now, he was a botanist, by the way, in case you're wondering by that title. That's exactly what he was. He was a naturalist in botany. He is credited with the classifications of most genuses of plants that still stands today. His system of classifying them still stands today. His description of male and female plants and stamen and pistils still stands today. But after his exhaustive years of doing botany, of studying the plant life, flora and fauna of the world, he decided to delve into animal behavior, and as such, he's one of the first people, if not the first. To my knowledge, his is the first writing that actually put man in an animal category. He decided to classify the animal kingdom the way he had done for decades the plant kingdom. Now he decided to classify the animal kingdom that way, and as such, he put man in as a top of the line in the animal kingdom. Now, it wouldn't surprise anybody to know that in those days, he immediately received a lot of backlash. from other botanists, from other anatomists, from religious leaders, saying man doesn't belong in the category of animal. Doesn't matter how many things are similar between them and animal. Man made in the image and likeness of God should be apart, set apart, totally different. His reasoning, cognitive skills, and so on and so forth make him a totally different creature, and I get that. But you should also know that the works of Carolus Linnaeus, the works of this man were studied by Darwin, and he had a great influence on Darwin later on, who gave us the theory of evolution. Does anybody even call it that anymore? I bet kids are taught evolution and never even hear the word theory of evolution anymore in school. That might not be right, but I wouldn't be surprised. The 4 categories he thought existed in 1720s were European whites, Asian tawnies, African blacks, and American reddish. In 1737, however, still modifying his Systema Naturae, Linnaeus wrote a long piece. I'm just going to give you these 2 lines out of it. It's in your handout if you come by church and pick one up sometime. But, or we'll mail one to you if you're not in the area. But in 1737, Linnaeus wrote that God created one human. And from that one human came every other description that he had named in his Systema Naturae. And then he wrapped that paragraph up by saying, he did not make all these people to be distinct species. There's one human God started with, therefore there is only one species of humanity, and that one species is white, tawny, black, reddish, or whatever else might come along. By the late 90s, someone influenced by him, Johann Blumenbach, categorized humanity into 5 layers. He embellished a little bit and improved off of Linnaeus in his mind anyway, and he gave us Caucasian, which comes from Caucasus, a geographic location, Mongolian, Malayan, Ethiopian, and American. In the 1790s, Blumenbach also wrote, the many varieties of man, however, are one and the same species. Blumenbach, after his delineation of color of skin and features of faces and bone structure, still came back to say these did not come from different species, and nor are they a subspecies within a species. All of these things we call humans are all of the same species. You know, and we know that. We know we have the same blood. We know we carry the same DNA. We don't have anything similar to animals. We have a human condition that's synonymous between every race existent on the planet. And so it just makes you wonder, when did a race become, those descriptions were so primitive in 1790. And we go through the 1800s, America's already a booming continent, and what's going on with these studies and the people, the scientists and the doctors and the anatomists and the botanists who are trying to work on, you know, once somebody puts something in print like Linnaeus did, and then Blumenbach, well, somebody's got to keep embellishing and adding to it, and then here came Darwin with his theories. And so we'll jump to America for just a moment and point out that in 1790 in America, the same time when Blumenbach was discovering what he thought were five different skin colors and not species, but appearances of man. The 1790 U.S. Census form only divided people into 2 categories in 1790. Free whites and slaves. I pulled up a copy of it. You can find it online, and it was interesting that that's really all. You listed yourself as a free white or a slave. And so if you were free in some other color, you were just a free white. If you were slave, it did not say blacks, because there were Irish slaves. There were slaves from a few other unfortunate souls that, got sold on ships like blacks did coming out of Africa. And so you were just a slave. If you were an Irish, red-headed Irish slave, and you filled out the census, you were not a free white, you were a slave. And if you were a free black man, you still put free white. You check that side because you're no longer a slave. That was in 1790. You ought to see, did I put it? I think I did. In just 30 years, the census form went to colored persons. Now we had these categories: free whites. When you fill out your census form 30 years later, you're either a free white, or you're a slave, or you're no longer a free white if you're a different color. You're a free colored person. And so it didn't matter what color you were. If you weren't white skinned, now you were a free colored person. Remember, 30 years ago, they shouldn't have said free white. They should have said free people and slaves if they wanted to delineate that way. But it was free whites, and people didn't know, what do I do? I'm not white. Well, you're not a slave, put it on free whites. So they modified it 30 years later, and they had free whites, free colored persons, and then slaves. And that was in 1820. Look at this. This is in 2010s, 10 years ago, the United States Census Form 10 years ago. Look how far we have come. 10 years ago, you had these choices for your census form in America. God bless us. What a wonderful thing. Look at this. White, black, African American, or Negro. The third category, American Indian or Alaska Native. And then below that, print the name of enrolled or principal tribe. And then for Asian Indian, Chinese, Filipino, Japanese, Korean, Vietnamese, Native Hawaiian, Guamanian or Chamorro, Samoan, other Pacific Islander, print race, for example, Fijian, Tongan, and so on, and other Asian print race, for example, Hmong, Laotian, Thai, Pakistani, Cambodian, and so on. What is that? 14 different categories of races. My, how we've grown from Linnaeus and Blumenbach, who only saw 4 and then 5. And now we see 14 with the possibility of subtitling on 3 different lines on the 2010 U.S. Census. And so I just have to ask a simple question. I don't think anybody can answer it. I don't think any congressman or senator or any of our politicians would ever dare to answer it. But whatever purposes might a government have to need to identify in minutia a person's race? Why so many racial descriptions? Why are they needed by a government? Will it matter to your employment? Will it matter to your school acceptance? Will it matter to your entitlement or privileges or benefits if you belong to a white race or any other race? There's a simple point to this, and I elaborate more on it in the handbook than I'm going to here. But the simple point is there is no reason at all that a person's race or ethnicity should need to be listed on census forms, on job applications, on school applications, unless there is an implied entitlement to a race. If there's an entitlement coming to a white person, it behooves you to put white, that in itself is racism. If there's an entitlement to a black person or an Asian person, and that's the reason we need to know, because there's an entitlement, that alone is racism. Racism, by definition for this lesson, is any preferential treatment shown to anyone because of the color of their skin, or any deferential treatment shown to anyone because of the color of their skin. If you punish someone because of the color of the skin, you are a racist. If you dislike or distrust someone because of the color of their skin, you are a racist. If you promote or benefit someone because of the color of their skin, you are a racist. Any assumption of superiority or inferiority based on a color of skin is racism. It always leads to deferential treatment of the presumed inferior groups, and any government that intentionally divides its citizens into racial groups assigns inferiority and superiority to some of those groups. We are living in a country who has assigned inferiority and superiority, whether they mean to or want to or not. We're living in that era. And so we come to, well, what in the world are we going to do? What is a Christian to do? And so let's walk through a couple of things real quickly that a Christian can do. First of all, the Christian position has to be that all men are created by God from one source. That has to be our position. There's no reason in the world for us to say, well, you know, God made that group, but he made them a little different than this group. No, he didn't. God made Adam, God made Eve. Every single human being had to pass through that early beginning of Adam and Eve. If you want to refine it down a little bit more, you can come to Noah and say everything got wiped off, and it's just Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth and their wives. Don't know what race Noah was. Don't know what color of skin any of them had. I suspect it wasn't like mine. And yet, that's the beginning point again. To Noah, God said, replenish the earth, fill it again. Incidentally, he said the same thing to Adam. He said to Adam, fill it again. Might have been something here before Adam, probably was. But to Noah, fill it again. Okay, God, how do you want me to create the Asians and Hispanics and whites? No, you just be prolific. You, your sons, your grandsons, just have children, spread this thing out. Let's go. Recreate, repopulate. Every human being, regardless of color, regardless of where they live today, came from the same God. Any Christian who doesn't understand that just needs to go back and reread Genesis over and over, the first few chapters. All things came from God. All things were created by God. And God did not start with 6 different families to give us 6 different colors. All of those things are capable within all of us. It's a moot point, and it's one that I shouldn't even mention because of the clock ticking. But just intermarriage between races and the resulting offspring, you just start putting a black man, white woman together, and then they have a child that's different. Let that child marry someone from another mixed marriage, and then they're going to have a different child, and then their children are going to have, and you know, after a while, we would melt this thing out until everybody was pretty much the same if we just all intermarried. That idea alone tells you, okay, that means all of us carry these same genes within us. Every single one of us. I've been chuckling over the last few years with the DNA and the people that you can get your DNA tested and see what you got in you. And then people say, I'm 20% African, and they're white as a ghost. Well, yes, you are. And that's what we're trying to say. Resident within this creative thing God made is every human being. And to deny that is racism. To believe, well, my race is, no, your race is just one of all God created. And so Christians have to accept this sooner or later in their walk with God, that all men are created by God. All men are created from one source, and all men, therefore, back to Adam and Eve, were created in the image and likeness of God, regardless of the color of skin. All men are equal, therefore, not because the Constitution says so, but because God says so. All men are equal, and all men are exactly worthy of exactly the same respect. So let's talk about Christians. Christians are called to the golden rule, Matthew 7:12, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. That's our rule. That's our modus operandi. That's the way we're supposed to treat everybody. Let's wrap this up by talking about what Christians can do about racism in their world today. Number one, they should remember their calling. What is the calling of a Christian? To present the gospel of Jesus Christ to the world. That's the calling of a Christian. You're not called to be political activist. Nothing wrong with being a political activist as long as you don't let that supersede your calling of the gospel of Jesus Christ. If you ignore the gospel of Jesus Christ and you're willing to lose the souls of men to win a political point, then you're completely out of line and you've missed the point of the calling of a Christian. Christians are called to teach and preach the gospel, all Christians. Christ's last message on the Mount of Transfiguration, Matthew 28:19, go into all nations, teaching men to observe all the things I've commanded you, baptizing them in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. His last commandment, go into all nations and teach men. Don't just go to one or two nations. Don't just teach a handful. Go into all nations and teach men to observe all the things I've taught you. That's the gospel of Jesus Christ. That's my calling. That's your calling. That's exactly the way it's supposed to be. Number two, Christians are supposed to correct sin when they see it, error, and they're supposed to do it in love. If I see somebody behaving wrong, and we're talking about race tonight, so if I see somebody behaving racially improper, incorrect, I'm kind of obligated to kind of drop a hint. Yeah, you shouldn't do that. In love, you shouldn't say that. I don't mind telling you that I lost a few friends last year in the racial climate that was going on in America and the George Floyd funerals. I saw a handful of people, both black and white, berating and belittling and badgering and swearing at others because they didn't agree with them. And I'm not talking about the world's crowd. I don't care what the world does. I care about the church of God. And when I see Christians mocking, smearing, slamming other Christians because they simply don't agree with their point of view, if it's someone I know well enough that I can offer them a correction, I did that to a couple of people. I sent a private message, not public walls. I sent a private message. I think that you're doing damage to the cause of God and to your own cause. I didn't get good responses back. I got dropped friendships, and I got some pretty ugly things said back. That's not my obligation. My obligation is not to make somebody else nice and good. Mine is to keep loving and to correct in love. James said, you know, if you convert a brother from his sinful ways, hey, you've converted him. You've converted. That's what you've done. You've taken him from dark back to light. You've taken him from sin to righteousness. And so we try, and if we do try to correct anybody, we do it in love. Christians should know that racism damages Christianity. I can't imagine any scenario where having a racist mentality and a racist attitude actually glorifies Christ and the people that he died for. He died on Calvary for every single human of every color in the world. And for me to be prejudiced against the color damages the message of Christ and what he did on Calvary. Christians can contact racist entities and politicians. I keep out there in the foyer in our church, our local church here, I keep a page in the foyer that has our senators and our congressmen and our state representatives' phone numbers and our email contacts in the foyer for that very purpose. Not so we can be activists, but they work for us. They're our representatives. They need to know what we believe and what we think. And when I see them making or voting on policies and rules that I think are incorrect, I send them a letter or an email. And so should you, because that's the one thing I can do. When I see my senators voting for abortion bills or my congressmen, I send them a letter. My opinion, I wish you wouldn't vote for this. I hope you don't approve this. I hope you understand that it's just as easy for you to take that out and fight for it to be removed from that bill as it is for you to cast a yes vote. That's my prerogative. In love, expressing an opinion. That's why we keep those addresses out there. That's what Christians can do. And Christians can also pray. And maybe the most important thing that we can do these days is pray. It's very difficult to be heard on the subject of race. People have already preformed their conclusions and their opinions, and it's very difficult to convince anybody that you really are taking a righteous approach and a biblical approach. There are people who think that, the only way to prove you're not racist is, as Koch said, be less white. That's embarrassing, and that's also racist. The fact that that was even mentioned in their material within their company, that's embarrassing, that they even use that phrase. I can't imagine them saying to a black, be less black. That alone ought to tell you, oh, that is a racist thing they did. They just divided people by the color of their skin. I know that wasn't their intention, but they did that. They divided because they brought up the color of skin, and then they put one group down. You shouldn't be that. That's wrong. And everybody knows that. I don't know how that slid by them. They didn't do it. They let an outside company come in to train, and that was in their training material, in case you missed that. But that was it, and that's just so racist. What can we do on that kind of thing? Not much. You're going to still go buy your Cokes, or you're not. I kind of swore off Sprites for a while. I don't know how long that'll last, because they're made by Coke. But that's not really the solution. They're the things that we can't write to senators or congressmen about, the people that we vote to represent us. The things that we can't get company leaders and CEOs to see and rationalize. We're not going to change the world. It is what it is. God has already told us how it's going to be in the last days, and it's going to get worse. You'll be hated of all men for my name's sake. Jesus said that. And so we know those days are coming, but in the meantime, he gave us this wonderful thing we don't use very often, and that is prayer. Even in the Old Testament, we're fond of quoting from Chronicles. We love that verse, chapter 7, verse 14. We love that verse. If my people, which are called by my name, will humble themselves and pray, turn from their wicked ways, then will I hear from heaven, and I will heal their land. And so here we are, knowing that there is racial profiling and racial discrimination still existent, maybe as much now or more than in recent history. Might even be worse now than the last 100 years. What are we going to do about it? Get on Facebook and fight and protest and say snarky things? Or can we really go before God and believe that our prayer matters? According to James in the New Testament, the effectual, fervent prayer of a righteous person really does avail much, meaning it can change things. So my conclusion about the racial debate in America is, number one, it was never named in Scripture because it's a relatively modern problem. We don't even see descriptions and thereby government tagging onto it and thereby creating the separation of people by the color until the late 1700s. Imagine that. Just in the last 250 years, this has been written and divulged in to such an extent that governments have seized upon it for whatever purposes they use. What can we do today about all this? We can pray. We can ask God to change the hearts of men. We can ask God to change the hearts of our leaders. We can ask God to change the hearts of the people you meet in the street and in the stores. And most of all, we can ask God to change right in here, our heart. When our heart changes, it has a way of rubbing off on those around us. And if you just influence 5 people, and each of those 5 people influenced 5 more apiece, and each of those influenced 5 more apiece, you could affect literally thousands of people within a year's time, bringing them back to the heart of love, to the fact that God created all of us as one, and all of us are equal in the eyes of God, and every single human being, from the smallest of stature to the tallest, from the lightest of skin to the darkest, every single human being is made in the image and likeness of God. And the best course of action for Christians to take is to get us back on our knees and ask God, take us all back to you, the heart of love. Love God with all your heart and love your neighbor, whose skin might be a different color than yours, as equally as you love yourself. Thank you, God bless you, and thank you for tuning in and watching.